he slammed my suitcase onto the lawn like it was trash. It landed with a hollow metallic thump that sounded louder than anything else on the street. Louder than the hum of the dryer in the house 2 doors down. Louder than the neighbor's radio. My scrub top smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. I stood there in the driveway with the hospital badge still clipped to my pocket, and for a second the world narrowed to fabric and canvas and the small pool of clothes spilled across the grass. From the bedroom window, a silhouette watched. She had my robe on, the one my mom bought me for Christmas 5 years ago, the faded floral, the soft cotton that always smelled like her perfume. My robe, my house, my life suddenly set out on the lawn like a yard sale. Phones rose across the street. I could hear the little camera lights, neighborly flashes, the soft click of recording. Mrs. Patterson from next door in her folding chair with a cup of decaf held her phone steady. Mr. Kowalski stood by his truck, jaw tight, recording with both hands. Jenny Morrison, whose kid plays with my neighbor's son, pressed the phone to her ear as if she would speak into it later, not now. He didn't look like a man who had something to hide. He looked like a man who'd rehearsed this. He walked slowly back to the bedroom and shut the door behind him, the click final. I could feel my heart arranging itself into the rhythm I always kept at work, steady, controlled, precise. Panic was loud. Composure is quieter. I chose the latter. I picked up the phone. I had saved one number months before. It wasn't the number I'd thought I'd ever need, but I'd kept it, half practical preparation, half superstition. I pressed it and held the phone between my shoulder and my ear while I set my shoulders, like the world was a set of stairs I could climb deliberately, one step at a time. 20 minutes, I said into the line, as if I were giving an instruction to myself. Don't engage, just wait. Okay, the voice on the other end answered, calm and immediate. We're on our way. There are moments when waiting feels like action. The 12 inches between your chest and the place where your breath should sit become territory you inhabit. I sat down on the edge of the doorstep like it was a bench at church. The suitcase was beside me, canvas scraped and smelling of dryer sheets and the faint perfume my mother favored. I ran my fingers over the zipper and felt the dented metal, the tiny tear where a seam had come loose months earlier. I did not close my fingers around it like I wanted to hurl it back. I waited. 19 minutes. 18. Neighbors moved with the economy of people who know each other's boundaries. Mrs. Patterson's hand brushed mine when she came forward with a paper cup of coffee, black, just the way I take it. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. I've seen this street hold its breath before. The man, my husband, though the documents sometimes spelled his name differently, didn't come back out. When I thought of how people would later tell this story, they'd pick an image, the trash on the lawn, the robe in the window, the way the kids in the cul-de-sac went silent. For me, the first image is simpler, the way the neighbor's phone screen reflected my face and made me look small, like a thumbnail in a news feed. I had known suspicions for months. They don't arrive fully formed. They are little currents that pull at the hem of your day. He came home late, smelled of a cologne I didn't recognize. There were nights when he returned from working late and stood in the doorway looking at the photo frames on the mantel with something like regret in his face that he didn't show to me. There were bills I found folded into the bottom of his drawer like secrets, receipts for dinners at restaurants he claimed to have never visited. I told myself I would wait till I had proof, till I had an answer. Proof has a way of becoming a thing you both hunt for and fear. My mother saw it first. She'd been sick for a while, small, steady declines that we both watched like two people, peering through the same window at different times. In hospice, she would hold my hand and speak in lists, her allergies, her favorite books, the people she trusted. She spoke about practical things with the same tenderness she used to speak about me picking out dresses at 13. When she pressed my hand and said, "You never have to worry about the house, honey," I thought it was the kind of thing a mother says because it's soothing. Later, in small, careful conversations and a stack of marked-up papers, I realized she had been arranging not just my comfort, but my defense. I had thought of moving before all of this. I had imagined handing keys to someone else and starting over. But the house was more than a roof. It was where my mother taught me to knead bread in the autumn light. It was where I hung framed prints with crooked nails, and where my father's old watch, broken and heavy, sat in a drawer. To lose more than a marriage, to have the place that held those small continuities taken away in a public spectacle, felt like a theft of memory. 17 minutes. 16. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I've always believed there is dignity in measured responses. Panic is loud and tells you things you won't want to believe. Calm gathers evidence and waits for witnesses. The block's witnesses were here, people who had watched me plant petunias the summer my mother moved in, who brought casseroles when my mother was in hospice, who knew the sound of my laugh at holiday dinners. The street collected their phones like little altars. My phone screen glowed. From the house across the way, a man in a painter's cap motioned his wife closer. They mouthed my name like an incantation. I sat on the steps and let the voices of my neighbors settle around me like a net. At 12 minutes, a truck pulled up to the curb. Not the kind of truck you expect when you want support. No dramatic law enforcement vehicle, no dramatic lights. Instead, a small sedan coasted to a stop, and a man in a worn suit got out. He moved as if he'd been through this sort of thing before. His jacket was scuffed at the elbows. He walked across the street without glancing at his phone. When he reached me, he held a manila folder close to his chest like a shield. He looked at me, and I saw tiredness and purpose in the same face. "Sarah Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes." My voice was steady. Saying my name aloud felt like reclaiming it. "Richard Brennan," he said with a nod. "Attorney. I represent the Mitchell estate." Relief and a fierce, stupid hope rose in my chest so quickly I had to blink to keep my world steady. Someone had come on time. The practiced calm of months of planning had finally met its hinge. "You're on time," I said, and I laughed then, a little too sharp. He opened the folder, not for me, but to glance at the stack of papers inside, like a man checking that the tools were in order. His hand was steady when he pulled a folded envelope from the top. He didn't make a show of it. He walked to the front walkway and then up the porch steps as if walking towards a bedside. "There's someone in the bedroom," I told him. He paused a beat, the kind of pause a professional takes when they know the rules matter. He looked toward the house, then back at me. "Stay where you are. Don't go inside. I need to speak with the man who lives here." I thought of the words I had rehearsed in the night, the things my mother had said about calm and legal preparation like an heirloom given for survival. I remembered the files we had gone over at the kitchen table, the stamp of signatures under my mom's handwriting. I had believed the paperwork to be a shield. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how literal that idea would become. 10 minutes. 9. From the window, the curtain shifted and a head appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. The robe was gone. The silhouette from the bedroom stood in the doorway, arms folded, the kind of watchful posture practiced by someone who knows there are cameras in the crowd. Richard knocked on the door 3 times. The sound echoed down the hallway in a way that made the street lean forward. I watched through the glass as the man on the other side of the door opened it with a swagger that was meant to be casual, the kind of casual that pretends there is no script. He saw Richard, and for the first time I saw something like calculation slip from his face. "Mr. Mitchell," Richard said, and the voice had the calm gravity of one who has read and reread the papers he holds. "My name is Richard Brennan. I have documents to deliver." "Delivery?" the man said, voice pitched higher than his gait. "I'm not the one. You live here." Richard's words were simple, precise. "I've been instructed to serve these documents to you. Please step outside." He stepped outside. He looked at the street and saw the phones, the neighbors, the woman in a robe who had once been a friend. His confidence, which had been energy-sapping for months, took on a brittle edge. I had watched him put on that confidence like a coat, but it did not fit him now. Something in the way his shoulders tightened told me this was not a surprise. For months, he'd moved like a man who could hide things in plain sight. That look of betrayal hadn't been aimed at me, it had been aimed at certainty, at the belief that the life he'd rearranged would hold. Now, standing on the porch with a dozen witnesses, he seemed smaller. "Open them?" he asked. Richard placed the folder on the top step like a bridge. The man reached down and picked up the first paper. He didn't read it at once. Instead, he looked up and for a moment tried to find the angle that would make everything acceptable. He scanned the top page and his face changed. I watched color drain in stages, first the cheeks, then the knuckles, then the neck. It's a slow, cruel bloom to whiteness. He swallowed, and there was a sound like a man clearing a throat of lies. "You're kidding," he said with the sort of incredulity people use to buy time. The papers were plain to anyone who had ever moved, signed, or been moved. Stamps, signatures, the kind of legal language that erases ambiguity. A deed, an order, something referenced a trust. The words irrevocable and transfer appeared in the margins like blunt instruments. The man who had thrown my life on the lawn looked at the paper as if it might bite him. "You don't understand what this means. You can't just—" "You were given notice of the transfer," Richard said evenly. "The transfer was executed in due form. The deed records you as an occupant, not the owner. The trust was created to protect the property for Sarah." A sound came from the street then, low murmurs, the rustling of plastic chairs, someone saying under their breath, "She did it for you, Sarah." It reverberated like a benediction. In the small moments when hate and loyalty divide the world, community becomes a quiet judge. He looked at me then, not with the man who had once called me in the night to say he loved me, but with the alien look of someone who had miscalculated his audience. "She had no right," he said. My mouth was dry, my hands were steady. "My mother had every right," I answered. The sentence surprised me with its steadiness. Saying it felt like lighting a candle. There was other paper, a restraining order attached like a warning label, an affidavit, a stack of investigative notes scrawled in the margins, dates and timestamps that matched the phone recordings my neighbors had made. The numbers whispered of sums I had known only in restless calculations. Loans signed in my name, checks processed that hadn't gone to household expenses. Signatures that once seemed so familiar now looked like someone else's handwriting trying on my life. He sank down on the front step as if the porch itself had become the only place for him to sit. His head in his hands, the fall of defeat looked different on him than on a man who admitted he had been wrong. This was a man who was beginning to understand he had been found out, and the humiliation that comes after discovery is a different kind of ache. "You're not the victim here," Richard said, not unkindly. "The documents show patterns consistent with forgery and unauthorized loans. We will have to have this investigated." There it was, the legal phrasing that would later be repeated like a chorus. I didn't expect absolutes. Nothing in paperwork promises quick justice, but the papers were a boundary,
They said what the private wrestling of suspicion and betrayal could not. There was a record, and the record had witnesses. 6 minutes. The woman from the window, Vanessa, stepped onto the porch then. Her face was composed, the way someone who practices a role becomes composed. She looked at the papers with a kind of bored curiosity, then at the man on the step. There was a moment when her eyes flicked to the street, to the phones, to the neighborhood that had come out in support of the person whose life she'd been wearing like a borrowed coat. Neighbors edged closer. Someone from across the street called, "Is she married?" like it was an answer to the puzzle. Conversation folded inward around the man with the papers. I felt a pressure in my chest like the sky before a summer storm. 5 minutes. Richard cleared his throat again and reached into his folder. He took out a smaller envelope and handed it to me through the screen of the open door. I took it with 2 fingers like I was handling a relic. The flap was sealed with a simple sticker. My name was on it in my mother's handwriting, the slant I recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards. I didn't open it in front of everyone. That seemed like a cruelty I refused to enact. There was a quiet that fell like the hush in a house when bad news enters and sits on the mantel like a new clock. Phones were still. Neighbors leaned in like the story was a magnet. The man, my husband, looked at the envelope as if it were a loaded gun. Before we proceed, I need to make sure you understand these are legal documents. If you refuse to accept them, we will leave them with a witness, but refusal will not change their effect. He looked at me, searching for me to be the containment of something I wasn't yet sure I had the right to be. I straightened the badge on my scrub top, felt the plastic against my chest like the sternum of someone who had learned to breathe through trauma. I said, "Deliver them."
He nodded, and the man on the step unfolded the first page. This, right here, is where I had expected the scream, the collapse, the dramatic scenes you see in television shows. Life had taught me that drama sells, but it also taught me that most real moments are quieter. The man read. His mouth moved around the words like someone reading a script in a language they didn't speak. His knuckles whitened on the paper. He held the page like it might disappear if he let it go. I watched the edges of his resolve curl. 4 minutes. 3. When his eyes finally left the paper, there was a softness there I had never seen. It wasn't contrition, it was the particular goatish expression of a man who has realized the flimsy scaffolding of his life is being dismantled in daylight. He reached for the woman on the porch, an attempt at solidarity that looked absurd in the context. 2 people trying to hold on to a life that had been held together by misdirection. "Do you have children?" someone in the crowd asked softly. And suddenly the presence of others, Vanessa's face, the man on the step, took on a sharper dimension. The street had not come to applaud ruin. We had come because the scene had hurt the fabric of our daily life, because the small domestic violence of humiliation can rot a whole block if not addressed. At that, the man flinched, and I saw a sliver of fear. Not the kind of fear that everyone knows. This was the fear of a person who suddenly saw collateral damage and felt it not as consequence, but as a mirror. 2 minutes. I sat there and thought of my mother again, not as a figure of loss, but as a strategist. She had been practical in ways that were sometimes hard to hear in the moment. She would make lists and fold them into envelopes and say, "If anything happens, you do this." When I was young, I resented the lists. I wanted the one-bedroom city life, the assumption that adult lives would unravel neatly if they unraveled at all. Later, I learned the strength of a plan people don't see until it saves them. The envelope in my hand was small and personal. I knew what my mother had been protecting me from and what she had done to act on that knowledge. You can love someone and still recognize the limits of what they can or cannot be trusted with. That's a kind of grief that requires both sorrow and gratitude in equal measure. 1 minute. The man folded his arms like a child trying to look big. He looked at the street, at the witnesses, at the man who had just disrupted his show, and then at me. There was a long, ridiculous hope in his eyes, as if a look could rewrite documents or burn signatures. Richard placed a hand on the doorknob. He said, "I have more papers, but before I continue, I need to document this." A sudden scrape of tires cut his sentence off. From down the block, a car slowed, and a figure emerged, walking briskly up the sidewalk. He moved with a purpose that made even the neighbors fall quiet. He was not the kind of person you'd notice in a crowd until he stopped and everything rearranged around him. He carried a notebook case. He wore a coat that had seen better days. He looked like someone who had been interrupted on his way home and decided with precise intent to come fix something. He looked at me and then at the papers, and his mouth formed a small, private smile. "Perfect timing," he said, and in the way he said it, the street exhaled. I had counted 20 minutes thinking that whoever arrived next would be some sort of deus ex machina. Life does not hand out miracles like props, and yet there are moments when careful preparation looks like providence. He took the folder from Richard and began to flip through the pages as if checking a recipe. His hands were sure. "Miss Mitchell," he said, nodding once, "I have been retained by your mother in the capacity of executor. She left instructions. I have copies of the deed here. The trust is irrevocable." My name in his mouth felt like currency. The papers rearranged themselves into meaning. People in the neighborhood shifted, some making the sign with their hands, not a prayer, but a shorthand that had to do with relief. I opened the envelope then, not because the public demanded it, but because there was a private thing I needed. I eased the flap. Inside were folded sheets and a smaller check, not large enough to fix everything, but large enough to be a lifeline. I could feel the tick of the street, the quiet of people who were witnesses, the way that the mundane truth of paper can cut through the performance of a man who would throw your belongings on the lawn. I did not read the entire letter aloud. Some things are for the room that holds your breath, but I read a line, a short clipped piece that belonged to the person who had been my protector, that she had transferred the house to me to make sure no one could take it from me, that she had documented concerns about forged signatures, and that she had chosen, in small mercies and terrible calculations, to leave a sum of money that she hoped would buy me time to find my feet. It was intimate and larger than the paper itself. The idea of someone choosing to sacrifice a piece of themselves, not through miracle, but through hard earthly choices, felt like a kind of holy thing. It was not supernatural. It was concrete and planned and full of love, and the kind of melancholy that comes when a person knows their end and chooses who they will be in it. The man who had been reading the papers, the one who had thrown my suitcase, had gone pale enough that his lips looked like their color had been washed out. He started to speak, but the words were small and broken. His arrogance had eroded into something close to shame. From the street I heard someone whisper, "She did this for her daughter." Richard cleared his throat again and adjusted his glasses. "There are more documents," he said. "I need to deliver them to you personally. However, because of the nature of these papers, I must do so where everyone can see the transfer of notice." He gestured to the lawn, to the phone cameras, to the block that had become a jury the moment his pen hit the pad. The man looked at the assembled faces and then back at me, as if gauging whether I would show mercy or take the last step. I felt none of the blood-boiling fury that late-night shows sell as revenge. Instead, I felt a steady resolve settle into the bones of me. My mother had set a boundary for me, and now the circle of witnesses would affirm it. It felt like reclaiming not just a house, but the right to not be humiliated on my own lawn. The man stood up slowly. He approached the pile of papers again, like someone stepping toward a cliff edge. He looked at me one last time. There wasn't so much pleading as there was an appeal for meaning. Perhaps he wanted to know what it had all been about. Perhaps he wanted me to be the audience that would make his actions make sense. I couldn't give him that. There is a dignity owed to truth, and the truth in front of me was organized and dry and stubbornly legal. It would not be swayed by his theatrics. "Stay here," Richard said softly to me. "We will take care of the rest." I sat back on the top step, the envelope folded in my lap like a small, secret sun. Around us, the neighborhood breathed and shifted. Phones were still recording, but the energy had changed. This was not a social spectacle. It was a restoration, not of what had been, but of what would remain. When the papers were read, the words did not explode in the way I had imagined. They landed, clean and bureaucratic, and for each line there was a tiny rearrangement of life. A deed here, a trust there, a recorded affidavit folding like a map. The man who'd thought he could throw my life on the curb found himself reading legal language that had been written in my mother's steady hand like a shield. The 20 minutes had become something else, not just a countdown, but a pivot. What had been a private accumulation of suspicion and sorrow became a public affirmation of protection. The neighbors who had once exchanged casseroles now exchanged the weight of witness. The phones recorded, yes, but they were more than evidence, they were testimony. When Richard finished reading, the man who represented my marriage for a time looked as if he'd been stripped down to plates of vulnerability. He did not shout, he did not fall to his knees, he simply folded his hands and let the days he had shaped crumble in the space between his fingers. Then, from several houses down, a car door slammed and footsteps quickened. Another figure moved along the sidewalk and stopped as if the moment had been waiting for him to appear. He carried himself with a different type of claim, not theatrical, but familial. He had the look of a man who'd been pulled in from a life he didn't expect to witness, but who had some old right to be here. He looked at the woman on the porch with a clarity that recalibrated everything. The shuffle of witnesses turned into murmurs again, and the air tasted like something about to change. It was not yet a resolution, it was a hinge. The papers had been served. The neighborhood had become my armor. The envelope in my lap held my mother's words and a sum of money that smelled faintly of sacrifice and hope. The man on the porch looked up at the approaching figure, and for the first time in the day, I saw genuine fear in his face, not the performative kind, but the kind that comes when the scaffolding of deceit meets the sturdiness of consequence. He looked at the man coming up the walk, and for a second, the bravado that had felt so permanent simply fell away. The porch light threw hard lines across his face, and all the little lies he'd built looked like a paper house in a storm. The newcomer stopped at the sidewalk, set his bag down, and took in the scene without a show of surprise. He was neither a neighbor nor a dramatist. He carried himself like someone who'd been pulled into someone else's crisis and decided to stay until it was over. Up close, the lines at his eyes suggested long, ordinary days, work, school drop-offs, the small patience of someone who'd learned to manage the unruly business of family. When he walked onto the porch, he didn't scan the phones or the faces. He looked at the woman on the step, then at the papers, then at me, as if checking a ledger only he knew how to read. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, in a voice that carried authority and a tired kindness, "I am Thomas Morrison." The name landed like a pebble in a still pond. I could see the recognition click across faces, neighbors trading looks, Richard straightening his shoulders, the man who had cast my life into the yard shrinking into something new. Thomas had a folded sheaf of papers in his hand. He set them down on the porch railing and unfastened one with a fingers first, make it official sort of motion. He didn't need to announce why he was there. The street already hummed with curiosity. "These are service copies," he said, passing them along so they could be seen. "A petition for divorce and custody documents. I am her husband." For a beat, the world narrowed to the rustle of paper. Vanessa's face changed in a way that wasn't costume. The composed look faltered. For a moment, she was just a woman who had been interrupted. "You're married?" someone asked from the sidewalk. It sounded less like accusation and more like the slow snap of a puzzle piece finding its place. Thomas didn't speak to the crowd. He addressed the woman. "Vanessa Morrison," he said, "I am serving you with these documents on behalf of our children. This is not a spectacle. It is a necessity." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He folded the papers and extended one toward her, the same way someone might hand over a child's lunchbox. There was no shouting, no dramatic pointing. There was the mechanical, procedural certainty of someone doing what had to be done. She took the paper with a hand that trembled only slightly. Her eyes flicked to the crowd, where the phones recorded, where my neighbors watched, and then to the man on the step. For the first time, she looked small in a way the cameras could forgive, exposed, not theatrical. Thomas turned to the man who'd been my husband. "You need to speak to me," he said simply. He did not say it like a threat. He said it like a fact that needed addressing. The man rose slowly, the porch steps creaking under someone else's choices, and the three of them moved toward the curb as if dragged by a rope of inevitability. A neighbor started recording again, but the scene had shifted. No longer intervention, now the unraveling of a scheme. From what Thomas said in short, clipped sentences, while neighbors listened and phones kept their small vigil, it became clear that Vanessa had woven a life with threads that weren't entirely honest. He spoke with an accumulation of evidence rather than theatrical flourish, patterns of behavior he'd noticed over time, tales that didn't add up, an odd absence of paper trails for some major claims. He spoke, most of all, as a man who had checked the boxes you check when you suspect someone you love has been living a second life. "When I looked up her history," he told the crowd in the hush that follows a concession, "I found records in other states, marriages, financial disputes, people who said they'd been deceived. I'm not a detective. I'm a father trying to protect my children." He did not name the children here. He did not need to. The paradox was cruel and obvious. The person in my robe had been wearing my life like a costume, and now citizens of 3 different households were trying to disentangle truth from pretense. People started murmuring, some voices sympathetic, some incredulous, but mostly the tone was one of stunned recognition. What looked like scandal had a shape that suggested a pattern. Vanessa's face went white then, and whatever composure she'd kept as a matter of performance slid into something more desperate. She moved toward the house as if to flee, then stopped, as if sudden shame rooted her to the wood of the porch. Thomas, who had come to serve papers for his children's sake, stared at her with the gravity of someone picking up a weight he never wanted. "Don't run," Richard said, the lawyer's voice adopting the kind of firm softness you hear in courtrooms. "If she leaves, we will document the attempt. If she stays, we proceed with what needs to be done." She turned toward Thomas. For a moment I thought pity might arrive, an honest human pity for someone trapped in contradiction. Instead, she laughed, a small, surprised sound, half incredulity and half denial. "You have no idea what you've walked into," she told him. Her voice had the brittle, sweet quality of someone used to performance. "This isn't about you." Thomas folded his arms, the way a parent does when there are no immediate solutions. "It is about me and our children now," he said, "and the truth." He passed a hand through his hair and looked at the documents again. A silence held then, like a pause in a song where a new chord is about to change the whole tune. Neighbors who had once been our background noise stepped closer, offering water, folding chairs, small practical things that made the scene less terrifying. Someone handed Thomas a paper cup of coffee. A child across the street resumed playing because there was nothing a child can do but keep living in the presence of adult storms. The cameras kept their sparing eye, but the tone of the gathering wasn't voyeuristic, it was civilian solidarity. There is a kind of relief that arrives when an ugly truth is given a name. It does not erase the wounds, it does not undo the humiliation of a suitcase on the lawn, but naming builds a map you can begin to follow. The man's face, my husband's, registered that map with a particular stomach-turning knowledge. Deception had consequences he hadn't accounted for. Thomas handed a folded printout to Richard. We ran a background check," he said, voice low, as if the loudness of his words might harm the children listening. "There are consistent reports. She has been married, she has children, she has—" He paused, and for once his voice broke. "She has defrauded people before." That phrase landed differently in a neighborhood than it does in a courtroom. Here, in the open air, with the scent of grass and the neighbors' casseroles lingering in the air, it was a clinical blow. The man by the street whom I'd once loved sank a little lower into himself. Shame does not always announce itself as repentance. Sometimes it shows up as the quiet of someone realizing their miscalculations have become public. Vanessa's jaw worked. "You don't know what you're saying," she told Thomas. Argument, denial, these were the last flares of a person losing control of their script. For the first time, though, there were people who didn't believe her. The cameras did not cut her slack. A neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, pushed her phone forward and said, "We have footage of you in here on that night, taking the robe and leaving with the car." Her voice did not accuse so much as report. "We recorded timestamps. We can share." Another neighbor, Mr. Kowalski, spoke up. "I have the date and time I saw you pull up. My security camera caught you on May 13th. We have the footage. We don't want trouble. We want truth." The presence of ordinary people with normal home cameras shifted the dynamic from spectacle to evidence. These were the small tools of modern neighborliness, phones, doorbell cams, dash cams, used now as testimony. They would later be cataloged and time-stamped and placed against a ledger of signatures and bank statements. For now, though, they were a chorus of ordinary eyes saying the same thing. I remember feeling curiously detached in those moments, as if watching a movie I'd written but had forgotten the ending to. The envelope in my lap, the letter and the check from my mother, felt heavier now, a private anchor in the middle of an increasingly public disentanglement. I thought of my mother's hand pressing mine in hospice and the quiet lists she'd made. "You never have to worry about the house," she'd said. She had acted on that. The house was my mother's last and perhaps most practical language of love. After the initial shock, the day became a sequence of small official motions. Vanessa signed the acknowledgement of service for the divorce papers because to flee would have been more telling than any denial. Thomas took photos with his phone. Richard documented names. I sat and watched the professionalism of people who understood how to translate private betrayal into public record. Neighbors came forward, offering password-protected files, timestamps, and chain of custody assurances for footage. A woman I didn't know well hugged me at one point and said, "You were right to call them." Her voice was the kind that had known too much and chosen to be kind anyway. Another neighbor left a casserole on the stoop as if food could anchor what legal paper could not. Later, when the morning had turned toward noon and the light slanted across the lawn, Richard handed me another envelope. He had read enough of the pages to know what had been preserved and what had been left to fate. "Your mother was meticulous," he said. "She made sure there was a trail. She named witnesses. She listed concerns." I opened the new envelope with hands that didn't quite obey me. There were a few short, clipped paragraphs from my mother, phrases I had tucked away in my heart and now heard again with the clarity of paper, that she'd wanted protection against a man she came to suspect, that she trusted me to carry on the care of the home and the small freedoms that go with it, that she'd left me money she did not need for herself because she wanted me to have choices when the dust settled. I read more. My mother's handwriting wavered in places, as if the pen trembled with fatigue. She spoke of choosing less aggressive treatment near the end, not as a heroic moral posture, but as a careful, practical decision that allowed her to allocate resources differently. She wrote that she could not right every wrong, but she could make sure her daughter would have a place to come home to. She asked me to be brave, to be careful, and to remember to breathe. That private reading, what I say to myself now was the hinge of the day, shifted me from spectator to the person who had to choose what to do with a life rearranged. Rage could have been the first answer. Instead, there was a cool, practical energy, my mother's final inheritance, a shorter fuse for drama, a longer attention for the work of repair. For months afterward, people would ask if the money softened anything. The answer is complicated. $40,000 is not magic, but it is possibility. It bought me time to speak to attorneys, to begin the work of forensic review for bank statements, and to create a small emergency fund so I could sleep without the dread of immediate eviction. It bought me the ability to step into a different posture, the posture of someone who could plan. I did not squander that gift on theatrics. I used a portion of it to hire investigators to look at the signature patterns and the loans that had been signed without my knowledge. I reserved some of it to open an account that would be solely for housing security. A part of it I held aside for the creation of something my mother would have liked, a practical resource for other women who found themselves waking up to betrayal in daylight. But none of that happened instantly. For now, the day concluded with a practical, almost clerical sort of closure. Vanessa left the porch under the escort of a neighbor who had been present since the start. No one made a spectacle of it. She moved out of the home that had been my mother's and my own, taking only what she could carry. Her departure was not triumphant. It was small and lonely, and I felt for the children whose images flickered in the background of this revelation, a reminder that collateral hurt is not the entertainment people sometimes hope for. Thomas stayed to talk. He and Richard compared timelines and passed around printouts. I listened. They spoke in terms of custody and protection, of what could be done to shield the children without exposing them to scandal. They were careful with words about minors. Beyond the fact of their existence and the need for their privacy, the public record should be protective, not prying. I respected that. Part of dignity is holding space for others whose lives touch yours. That afternoon, the house felt like a body recovering after fever. Neighbors left casseroles and their recordings. A woman pushed a bag of diapers onto my porch, a practical, awkward offering for a woman she'd barely known until that morning. These gestures, small, ordinary, human, began to stitch me back together in a way legal papers could not. Over the next weeks, formal processes took shape. Investigators called. Richard drew up a list of what to preserve and what to avoid, procedural things, not advice for the public. The police logged statements where appropriate. I filed claims that needed filing. The financial links, the loans, the signatures, these were things to be unraveled by people with access to ledgers and time. I learned how slow justice can be without confusing it for absence. I also learned how fast community can move when it decides to keep someone safe. People who had been briefly present that morning became steady hands on my life. Mrs. Patterson checked the mail for me for weeks. Mr. Kowalski offered to install a new front lock system. Jenny Morrison brought over a shelf she'd found at a garage sale because you need places for cups, she said, as if cups could re-anchor domestic life. The $40,000, my mother's last practical gift, became both a literal bank source and a symbolic seed. Richard suggested gently that there were many women who would have benefited from a small fund like the one my mother had created, a place to step while sorting the aftermath of domestic rearrangement. The idea stayed with me, like a song that won't stop humming. I began to talk to a few women I trusted, neighbors, a nurse from the hospital where I worked, a woman who ran a small legal clinic downtown. The conversations were quiet at first, soon deep. These were not the wide, declarative meetings you see on television. They were kitchen table conversations about what happens when someone's life is undermined from the inside, where to find legal help, how to preserve evidence, how to budget after betrayal, how to emotionally survive the humiliation of public spectacle. We formed a loose coalition, practical and small at first. We called it something practical and hopeful, Second Chapter Society. The name felt right because none of us wanted to act like a victim panel or a pity club. We wanted resources, workshops on financial literacy, pro bono lawyers who could take a case when necessary, support circles that would teach how to tell one's story without having it become a script for someone else's gossip. The first meeting was in the back room of a church that offered its space for free. We could only fit a dozen women. Someone made coffee, someone else brought tea. We sat in folding chairs and wrote down lists. What proof do I need? Where do I file for an emergency order? Who can help me get immediate housing? We passed around a binder that included templates for documenting suspicious transactions, contacts for therapists who specialize in relational trauma, and the names of a few professionals who would consult pro bono. It was not glamorous. It was utterly necessary. I spoke at that first meeting, not as someone healed, but as someone practical. I told people what my mother had done, not to sanctify her choices, but to show the power of small preemptive acts, an irrevocable trust here, a typed letter there, a small check tucked away to give someone time. That first room was the place where grief turned, awkwardly and gratefully, into action. Word spread slowly but steadily. The binder grew. A local paralegal volunteered to help catalog recordings. A retired accountant offered to teach a monthly class on detecting fraud. Thomas and his wife, Vanessa's estranged legal spouse, wheeled in a stack of documents and quietly offered to assist when it came to the children's protection, as parents do when children are at risk. It felt like the messy, imperfect collaboration of people trying to fix what had broken. In the months that followed, my life became a careful balance of ordinary work and extraordinary paperwork. My shifts at the hospital kept me tethered to routine and the peculiar consolation of steady hands performing their daily miracle, cleaning rooms, changing IVs, delivering bad news with clarity. The forensic accountants took longer than I'd hoped. The loans were not always straightforward. Old signatures looked, in some documents, eerily like mine, and in others like a clumsy imitation. It would take time. I kept telling myself, time is a kind of currency. There were nights when grief came anyway, unexpected, sharp. Sometimes it arrived in the house like a cold draft, in the place where my mother had once sat and read the paper. I would go sit at the kitchen table and open the envelope she had written in her last months. Her handwriting had become an intimate map, lists of passwords, naming trusted friends, instructions to cancel certain memberships, the names of charities she liked. In the same strokes, she had left me a moral map. Be brave, but be kind. Protect your home, but not at the cost of your soul. I hung a photocopy of that small letter in my kitchen, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. The paper was framed next to a photograph of my mother pounding bread in a flour-dusted apron, her laugh frozen mid-giggle. Together, they reminded me of two kinds of legacy, one practical, one humane. The second chapter society evolved. We started offering monthly workshops in a local community center, how to keep your financial house in order, when to call a lawyer, and caring for yourself in the midst of chaos. Volunteers from the neighborhood rotated bringing snacks. A young lawyer I met at a clinic offered to help with forms. A local reporter did a piece, careful and dignified, that focused on the systems women can use to protect themselves, rather than a salacious portrayal of betrayal. The coverage brought more women to our meetings, some with stories like mine, some with scars I could not imagine. People began to send small donations. The $40,000, which I'd intended partly to seed such efforts, became a match fund used sparingly to help women cover retainer fees or emergency housing. We kept rigorous records. We were, after all, the sort of organization that began as an insistence that documentation mattered. In private, the legal threads progressed in ways that honored the rule of due process without promising miraculous closure. Investigations were opened, some fraudulent activity was identified and referred to the appropriate offices. People who had been harmed were given ways to present their evidence. I learned to let the legal system do its work without expecting it to be a cinematic finale. Real life rarely offers wrap-ups. Instead, it offers incremental fixes, and you accept those as enough. I started seeing a counselor recommended by a neighbor, talking about what had happened, about the public humiliation, the theft of small domestic rituals, and the deep betrayal was like pulling a loose thread. Sometimes the whole sweater came apart, and sometimes only a seam revealed itself to be frayed. In those rooms, I practiced naming the feelings without letting them define every day. I allowed myself slow grief and small pleasures. I allowed myself to laugh again. I also began to go out. At first, it was coffee with a neighbor, then a group class at the community center. Later, months after that first morning of spectacle, a man named Ben, a colleague from the hospital I'd known professionally, invited me to dinner. It felt strange to step into the tentative world of dating after having my life dismantled in public. I was cautious, I was honest. He listened like a person trained in the art of ordinary kindness. It was not a grand romance. It was a recognition that life continued and that companionship could be rebuilt in the sturdy, slow way real things grow. 18 months later, the house was full in a different way. The kitchen smelled of roasting vegetables, and the hallways hummed with conversation. I hosted a Thanksgiving that was not about performances or about making a point. It was about people who had been through hard things and decided, collectively, to sit at a long table. There were women who'd attended the second chapter society classes, neighbors who'd shown up the first morning, Thomas, quiet and careful, and a handful of new friends who had become family. There were also children playing in the yard, supervised and protected, faces turned away from cameras and toward one another in the uncomplicated way kids stitch friendships. We ate, we spoke softly about what's next, and at one point a woman stood and told the group about how the workshops helped her reclaim her financial paperwork after a messy separation. People clapped, but not loudly, more like an acknowledgement to a shared labor. The photocopy of my mother's letter still hung in the kitchen, framed now in a new border. Someone noticed and said, "That letter saved you." I said, "It gave me time to make decisions." My mother's handwriting was the weather vane for the house, quiet directions that had turned out to be far-sighted. I kept her words close, not as a talisman, but as practical instruction. She had taught me the difference between ownership and belonging. A house can be a title on paper, but it's a repository of memory and daily rituals. The smell of cinnamon in November, the awkward leaning of my father's old chair, the mark on the doorway where a child's height had been recorded. Protecting those things had become my work and my mission.
There were days when I couldn't help imagining different outcomes. What if I'd never called that number? What if I hadn't sat on the suitcase? Those if-onlys were fruitless. Courage is not always the fireworks moment people imagine. It can be the small act of following through on a plan your mother left you, picking up a phone, sitting down on a step, and refusing to be swept up in performative reaction. When people ask me now what to do in a similar situation, I tell them the same practical things my mother taught me, though never as legal instructions. Document what feels off, keep copies of important papers, cultivate witnesses, not to dramatize them, but have people who can confirm times and places, and, most importantly, trust your instincts to create space for planning. It is not about paranoia, it's about preparedness. People sometimes ask whether I'd forgive or whether I hold anger. The truth is complicated. There is, for me, no celebratory gloating in another's downfall. I have empathy for the collateral hurt, especially the children whose names I won't repeat, whose faces I won't expose. Their lives were entangled in a story they did not choose. My sense of justice is practical, accountability that preserves dignity. The legal processes continued in the background as legal things do, files and hearings, the slow arithmetic of claims and counter-narratives. I filed what needed filing, preserved what needed preserving. I let the professionals do their work without turning it into my entire life. I also let myself live. The Second Chapter Society grew into something modest and durable, a website with resources, a monthly drop-in clinic staffed by volunteers, a small fund used for emergencies. We held our first anniversary meeting in the same church basement where we'd begun. I stood in front of the room and did not speak as a hero, but as someone who had been given a second chance by a woman's careful planning and a community's willingness to show up. If you can, I told the room, use what you have to make life easier for someone behind you. I don't know what the long-term legal closure will look like for every person involved. I do know that for me, the house remained mine, not just because of ink on paper, but because people witnessed it and because my mother took steps to protect me. I do not gloat over the man who threw my life on the lawn. He is a man who will have to reckon with the consequences in the ways that consequence comes. Audits of behavior, the slow erosion of excuses, that is not for me to celebrate. It is, however, a fact of life that when deceit meets documentation, the truth has a way of making a stubborn entrance. Sometimes, late at night, I stand at the back door and look out at the patch of lawn where the suitcase once landed. The grass is thicker there now, and curiously, a small line of petunias my mother planted in spring has come back each year. The house still creaks in the old ways. The watch in the drawer is still broken, but I have learned to use time differently, less as a weapon, more as a ledger of growth. If there's a final thing I can offer, it is this. Prepare, but don't let preparation harden you. Make plans, keep documents, cultivate witnesses, but stay soft enough to receive help, to accept casseroles and neighbors who will sit and listen. Let your grief be honest. Let your anger be smart. Let your choices be gentle enough to leave room for healing.
The twist of that day, the arrival 20 minutes after the locks were changed, the man in the worn suit, the letter from my mother, the revelation of a con artist wearing my robe, was not a fanciful ending. It was a series of practical responses to a private betrayal played out in public. And the thing I keep returning to is simply this: people showed up. My mother planned, neighbors recorded, a lawyer read, a stranger named Thomas stepped in to protect his children. Together, that patchwork of small human acts built a rudimentary kind of justice. If this story has touched you in any way, please consider sharing a moment from your life or supporting community resources for people facing similar betrayals. If you have questions about how to connect to a local support network, check the description below for links to practical resources and to the Second Chapter Society's page, where we keep templates, lists of pro bono providers, and meeting times. If you know someone who needs to hear that they don't have to face the suitcase alone, send this to them. I still keep my mother's letter on the wall, not as a weapon against memory, but as a compass. It's faded at the edges now, like any good thing after weather and time. When I read it, I remember the woman who taught me to plan, who chose in the humblest way to keep my home safe. The twist that morning, an arrival 20 minutes after a lock change, was unexpected. The larger truth wasn't a twist at all, but a quiet design, love that prepares, and a community that holds witness.